Viruben Nandakumar அவர்கள் பிரித்தானிய தமிழ் கார்டியன் பத்திரிகையில் பத்திராதிபரான விருபன் நந்தகுமார் இந்து பசிபிக் பிராந்திய மையப்படுத்திய புவிசார் அரசியலும் ஈழத்தின் கடல் பகுதியில் அமைவிட முக்கியத்துவமும் ஈழப் பிரச்சினைக்கான தீர்வும் என்ற தலைப்பில் உரையாற்றுவார்.
Thank you, Mr. Arish Prabharan from Wales. I would now like to call upon Mr. Viruben Nandakumar, editor Tamil Guardian, to speak on peace in the Indo-Pacific region and its dependence on resolving the Tamil political problem on the island of Sri Lanka.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all of the impassioned speeches earlier today and for inviting me to speak. Small correction, I'm just a member of the editorial board, so slight correction there. So in terms of what I want to speak about, the focus of it is going to be, again, not on Malay Bible, but Sri Lanka's place within the Indo-Pacific region and how we should be thinking about global relations with Sri Lanka. Increasingly, we're seeing these kind of conversations on Sri Lanka being dominated by conversations about the East and West rivalry and competition with China. And I think, unfortunately, that we're seeing this kind of imposed narrative placed onto Sri Lanka, which I don't think is necessarily accurate. Because Western governments and India are so cautious of not wanting to isolate Sri Lanka and push it into the arms of Beijing, we're seeing too often Western governments want to back down from their rhetoric or not take forward actions such as sanctions or a referral to the ICC. My speech is to just address those points to illustrate why a policy of appeasement will not work with Sri Lankan leaders. And I think it's really important to take a step back and actually to look at Malay Baikal 2009 as a starting point of this kind of policy. So in 2009, the US State Department released a report in the aftermath of Malay Baikal in which they said humanitarian issues in Sri Lanka do matter, but they should not be the sole driver behind US policy. Instead, they wanted to look at a broader range of issues and not want to isolate Sri Lanka. So this is understanding where Western diplomats are coming from. Again, you've heard from other speakers there today, but the gravity of the crimes committed against Tamil civilians during that period, the indiscriminate shelling of hospitals, of food lines, murder of an estimated as high as 169,000 Tamil civilians during that last period. Similarly, in the UK, British diplomats and members of the House of Lords are too frequently speaking about China when they're talking about Sri Lanka. And I want to try and separate these issues. But before we go into the talk about geopolitics, I want to talk about how we actually got in today's situation of Sri Lanka being one of the first countries in the Asia Pacific to declare bankruptcy in several decades. It's also important to recognize that Sri Lanka is turning to the IMF for aid, not for the first time, not for the second time, but for the 17th time. Why Sri Lanka, an island which had so much promise at the start of independence, so frequently finding itself bankrupt and in cycles of violence? And again, that will come back to the unitary state which had been spoken about earlier. But at the moment, Sri Lanka is in crisis. It lacks basic necessities, food, fuel, medicine, and citizens are finding it hard to keep up with the cost of living. There's a myriad of factors behind this. So there's cronyism, corruption, as evidenced by the Pandora Papers. You can see how the Rajapaksa family and clan were able to, shuffle off their government money into their own pockets during the war. You can talk about the external factors such as the COVID pandemic. We can talk about reckless borrowing for white elephant projects, such as the Locust Tower. But for my talk, I really want to focus on A, militarization, and B, this economic model which has found itself incredibly dependent on foreign aid and foreign funds, as opposed to actually investing in projects which generate its own revenue. Talking about the economy, Sri Lanka's President Ranil Wickremesinghe, in his budget announcement, he drew upon the legacy of his uncle, J.R. Jayawardena, who was the first executive president, and ushered in a wave of neoliberal market reforms, and was seen as somewhat favourable towards the West. He, whilst not abandoning the principle of non-alignment that Sri Lanka had abided by, certainly moved it towards policy of greater embrace with the US and Britain. In Ronald Wickremesinghe's speech, he wants to draw upon his legacy and to build upon it as if this was a great thing for the island, and he wants to take this forwards by, himself selling off state assets, making sweeping slashes to the public sector, restricting the rights of unions to protest, and changing Sri Lanka to more of an export-driven economy. The issues, again, notably absent from Wickremesinghe's speech, is what Jayawardena means for Tamil people, which is his role in overseeing Black July, and we saw, the slaughter of thousands of Tamil civilians whilst their homes and businesses were burnt to the ground. Jayawardena also brought in the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allowed the police sweeping powers to detain Tamil youth, which led to issues of torture and abduction. And Jayawardena is also known for elevating the military presence. So by the 1990s, the military was the largest state employer. He did this for two reasons. One was to confront the threat posed by the Tamil militants, or to address and suppress the Tamil demand for self-determination. The other reason is that by inflating the military presence, it was a useful means to address the inequalities brought about by his own economic policies. Instead of investing into the country's wealth, they pumped millions into the military and white elephant projects that produced little for local people, both in the south and in the north. However, there was a turning point around the armed conflict. As the West became increasingly increased scrutiny of Sri Lanka's dire human rights record, particularly under the Rajapaksa administration, Sri Lanka shifted towards China as a partner who was willing to look at turn a blind eye to the genocidal slaughter of Tamils, and became the island's primary source of military aid alongside Pakistan, and worked to keep Sri Lanka off the UN's record, or off the UN's agenda. Under the Rajapaksa administration, militarization again was accelerated to an unprecedented extent. Today, the Sri Lankan military stands at twice the size of the UK's. And despite 13 years, more than 14 years have passed, the military continues to control vast swathes of Tamil land across the northeast. And under Rajapaksa's, war criminals were not held accountable. Instead, they were put into the height of government positions. This has often been to the detriment of the North and East. So having a military that is not engaged primarily, not engaged just in, external defense matters, but is involved in tourism, involved in port authorities, involved in agriculture, and is taking up Tamil land, has not been good for the economy or for Tamils in the northeast. According to one report, local Tamils have had to are unable to compete with businesses set up by the military, which obstruct free trade by selling their products at below market rates while stifling livelihood opportunities for those already impoverished. So what this means in essence is that in places across the northeast, you're having the military take land that rightfully belongs to Tamils, farm the land that should belong to Tamils, and selling it back to Tamils, kind of cutting their own businesses. So it's a dysfunctional economy, and alongside the kind of external shocks, that's why Sri Lanka has collapsed to the state it is. But now turning on to the geopolitical interests. As stated before, Sri Lanka's turned to the IMF 17 times. And whilst the US and its partners, including India, seem keen to lend Sri Lanka support, China appears reserved, and for good reason. Despite the end of the armed conflict, Sri Lanka has not proven itself a reliable partner for either the West or the East. Whilst offering aid and a temporary moratorium on debt, China has not agreed to the island's debt restructuring plans. Policymakers in Beijing, they're questioning what value is Sri Lanka. On the other hand, India has taken more of a leading role in supporting the island and securing an IMF bailout. For India, this means displacing China's foothold to their south as well as securing their trade routes. Yet, this relationship is also under strain because of Sri Lanka's pervasive Indophobia, which is central to Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. It's an ideology which views India and views Tamil Nadu in particular as a looming threat. And some examples of this may be their strong opposition to the East Container Terminal Agreement. 70% of transshipment business is linked with India that goes through the ECT, whilst only 19% of that is domestic trade for Sri Lanka. In these situations, there was strong Sinhala Buddhist backlash against ECT because it is seen as Sri Lanka somehow becoming another colony of India. So while Sri Lanka is currently leaning on India for support, this kind of constant ideological backlash to India's presence and India's support, which should raise doubt into over Sri Lanka's creditworthiness. The anti-Indian sentiment also could bar the development of the north and east, which could benefit from Indian investment. For the West, Sri Lanka's inability to hold the military into account or to bring about internal reforms remains a central area of concern as it continues to lead to cycles of instability and bloodshed. Just to speak about India's interests again here, India's interest, as stated before, is not purely benevolent. It is to secure their own security and to secure their trade investments and to create a stable partnership. As stated before, as stated in previous speaker's speech, they've been pushing for the 13th Amendment, an agreement which had been rebuked by successive Tamil leaders and which continues to hold central power by the presidency. The reason why I raised this is because whilst India is still continuing to push for this, what is actually needed is a break from is actual peace and prosperity on the island. And the way you get that is by breaking away from Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which opposes India's interests and opposes stability on the island, and actually pushing for a federal solution or pushing for recognition of self-determination by Tamils. But that leads me to my final point, which is, what needs to be done. Increasingly, we're seeing more decisive leadership of Sri Lanka in the form of sanctions. So, as noted before, the US has recently announced sanctions in this past year. Canada has actually imposed sanctions on the Russian products, which is excellent news. The UK is lagging behind in this regards. The UK has yet to sanction a single Sri Lankan military government official that's been implicated in war crimes. We're also seeing, in response to the proposed anti-terrorism bill, that the European Union has raised concerns over this proposed legislation, and member states, such as Germany, have warned that if Sri Lanka does not find itself in compliance with international laws, they may risk losing trade privileges under the GSP+. In the same time, the UK is pushing forwards with the developing countries trading scheme. So a question has to be raised here over the UK's commitments to human rights. If the UK is serious about accountability and justice in Sri Lanka, then it should tie its trading relationships with progress on human rights. The UK has, however, been a leading force at the UNHCR on Sri Lanka and helped to keep it on the agenda. The UK must go forwards to actually call for an ICC referral and for the establishment of an independent investigation, an independent international investigation into war crimes. Alongside this, so just to sum up, the UK must push for sanctions on Sri Lankan war criminals, must recognise self-determination of Tamils, and they should demand demilitarisation of the North East. In the run-up to the UK's Conservative Party's recent elections, the Prime Minister actually spoke on the problematic influence that the military has, and the government is yet to really forcefully push back on this. So I'm hoping it's something that can be taken forwards. Yeah, that's it for me.